You were my father, she said, her voice shaking but carrying across 20 armed men and a yard full of witnesses. Until you sold me for a rifle. 6 months earlier, she had not been able to speak at all. This is how she found her voice. When Elsbeth Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach at Ridgewater, Montana Territory, she did not find a husband waiting. No house, no garden, no white fence or warm hearth or any of the things the letter had promised. Just three bearded mountain men standing beside a flatbed wagon, shoulders wide as door frames, eyes sharp as skinning knives, and 100 miles of wilderness rising behind them, like a wall between this world and the one she had left behind. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. But what waited for her in those high pines was not cruelty. It was not punishment. It was something far more dangerous than either. Freedom. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week, and I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop a comment. Tell me your city, your state, wherever you are. I want to see how far Elsbeth's journey travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The September sun beat down on Ridgewater's main street with the kind of heat that turned tempers mean and patience thin as paper. Dust hung in the air like a veil of golden gauze, clinging to skirts and boot leather, settling into the creases of hard-worn faces gathered outside Brennan's general store. Ridgewater was not a town, not really. It was a cluster of buildings that had grown up where two wagon trails crossed near the Yellowstone River. A general store with the family living upstairs. A blacksmith shop where old McAllister shod horses for 15 cents apiece and mended wagon wheels for a quarter. A nameless saloon that was really just someone's back room with 2 barrels of homemade whiskey and a plank across 2 sawhorses pretending to be a bar. A post office that opened 3 days a week when the mail rider from Helena bothered to show up. The whole town smelled of dry horse manure, road dust, chimney smoke from the blacksmith's forge, and cured leather from the saddles drying outside the livery stable. If the wind shifted, you caught the sharp bite of whiskey from the saloon, mixed with the sweet green scent of hay from the meadows north of town. 30 people had gathered outside Brennan's. That was a crowd for Ridgewater. They had come for the spectacle, though not one of them would admit it out loud. They had come to watch Harold Whitmore hand over his daughter to the Kincaid brothers. Harold stood on the loading platform, a wooden stage where freight wagons were loaded and unloaded, and where on this particular September afternoon, a man was conducting the last transaction of his miserable decline. He was a lean man, gone to gristle, all sharp angles and harder edges. His face had once been handsome, perhaps before whiskey, and bitterness had carved it into something mean. His eyes, which had once been as blue as his daughter's, were now clouded with drink, red with sleeplessness, and narrow with the calculation of a man who had sold everything he owned and had finally arrived at the last thing left. His hand clamped on Elsbeth's shoulder. Not affection, ownership. My daughter, he announced, his voice carrying the practiced boom of a man who had sold livestock at auction all his life. 21 years old, healthy, literate courtesy of her mother before she passed. Good cook, strong back, never been courted. He patted the crumpled envelope in his other hand. The Kincaid brothers have paid the bride price in full. 1 Winchester rifle, $30 in goods, winter supplies. Fair transaction. Fair for who? Someone muttered from the back of the crowd. Nobody laughed. Nobody stepped forward to object. Nobody said what everyone was, thinking that a man who sold his daughter like a heifer on the auction block had lost the right to call anything fair. They just stood there watching the way people watch a storm approach from a distance. Curious, cautious, glad it is not their roof in the path. Elsbeth stood on the platform with her head bowed, fingers twisted in the coarse fabric of her navy blue traveling dress. The dress had been her mother's, altered and taken in the seams, showing where the fabric had been let out and then taken back again over the years. Dust from 3 days of stagecoach travel clung to the hem. The small cameo brooch at her throat, a pale pink profile carved in shell, was the only thing she owned that had belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Everything else had been sold. The farm, the livestock, the furniture, the kitchen table where her mother had taught her to read and write and do arithmetic by candlelight back when the world had made sense and Harold Whitmore had been merely weak instead of cruel. Elsbeth focused on the grain of the wood beneath her feet because looking up meant meeting eyes. Dozens of them, some pitying, most merely curious. all of them certain they knew how this story would end. She had known this day was coming, had felt it building for weeks in the way her father looked through her at supper as though she were a window. He was staring past to see something else. In the way he muttered over his account books late at night, the stub of a pencil scratching numbers that never added up. In the way he had started measuring her value in dollars instead of love, which was easy enough because he had stopped loving her the day Eleanor died and the dollars had run out shortly after. The advertisement had been placed in a territorial newspaper. Harold had written the response letters himself, forging Elsbeth's signature negotiating terms like a man haggling over the price of a draft horse. She had known nothing until the day he announced it. Flat, final. You are going to Montana. It is done. No discussion, no consent, no choice. Because in Missouri in 1873, a father still had the legal authority to determine the fate of an unmarried daughter, and Harold Whitmore had exercised that authority the way he exercised every other power in his life, carelessly, selfishly, and without a single thought for anyone but himself. And now here she stood, on a loading platform, waiting for three strangers to come collect their purchase. The crowd shifted, murmured, parted. Three shadows stepping through. Elsbeth saw the boots first. Three pairs of worn, leather dusty, but well-maintained, the kind that had seen 15 years of mountain trails and been resoled more than once. The leather was dark with oil and used the stitching tight and even the heels worn at the same angle on all three pairs. Men who walked the same ground. Men who had been walking it a long time. Her gaze traveled up slowly. Canvas trousers faded from sun and wash patched at the knees with neat squares of darker fabric. Wide leather belts with brass buckles tarnished to the color of old honey. Shirts of cotton and flannel rolled to the elbows, showing forearms roped with muscle and scarred with the small, white lines of rope burns and old cuts. Then shoulders, three sets of shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun as the men stepped forward and the crowd pulled back instinctively the way water parts around a boulder. Three men, tall enough that the crowd had to look up, wide enough that they filled the street, hands calloused and scarred knuckles, wide fingers thick with years of splitting wood, dragging timber, breaking horses and building with their bare hands, everything they needed to survive in a world that did not care whether they lived or died. The man in front was the tallest, the broadest. His hair was chestnut brown, medium length, naturally tangled with streaks of early gray at the temples that caught the afternoon light like threads of silver in dark cloth. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun, and something deeper than weather, something that had hollowed out his eyes and set his jaw into a permanent line of controlled stillness. A small scar crossed his left eyebrow, pale against tan skin. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky before the first snow, the color of creek stones under fast water, the color of something old and deep and patient. Caleb Kincaid. Everyone in the territory knew the name the way they knew about storms building behind distant mountains. Something to be watched, noted, respected, perhaps feared. He lived with his two brothers in the high pines, came down to Ridgewater twice a year for supplies, and spoke only when speech was absolutely necessary. Rumors trailed him like wood smoke, that he had been a Union Army scout during the war, that he had killed men, that he had lost a wife and daughter to Confederate irregulars who burned his homestead while he was away, that he had retreated from the world to tend his ghosts in silence and solitude, and that his two brothers had followed him up the mountain because that is what brothers do. The second man stood half a step behind and to the left, slightly shorter at 6'4", but leaner, quicker in the way he moved with the coiled alertness of a hunting animal. His hair was lighter brown, his eyes the sharp amber color of a hawk's, and they moved constantly, scanning the crowd, the rooftops, the alleys between buildings, never resting, never still. An old rope burn scar ran along his left forearm, white and smooth. He carried no rifle, but a long hunting knife hung at his hip, and a short bow and quiver were slung across his back. He moved without sound. Wyatt Kincaid. The third man stood slightly apart from the other two. The youngest, the shortest of the three at 6'3", but still taller than any other man in Ridgewater. His hair was auburn, catching red fire in the sunlight, and his eyes were the same amber as Wyatt's, but warmer, softer, with fine lines at the corners that suggested he smiled more often than his brothers. His hands were calloused like theirs, scarred across the knuckles, but there were also ink stains on his fingers. The stains of a man who worked with wood and steel all day and then sat by firelight at night with a pen and a book. His expression was more complex than his brother's. Worry, unease, and something that looked almost like guilt, as if he understood that what they had purchased was not goods but a person, and that the nature of this transaction was a stain regardless of intention. Everett Kincaid. Caleb stopped 3 feet from the platform and looked directly at Elsbeth, not the way her father's customers looked at livestock. He looked at her the way someone might look at a horizon they were trying to memorize. Grave, deliberate, and deep in those gray winter eyes a pain so old it had become geography. Then he turned to Harold. "You are Whitmore." It was not a question. Harold straightened anyway, startled into salesmanship. "That is right, Mr. Kincaid. This is my daughter, Elsbeth, as agreed in the letters." The letters said she was willing. Silence fell over the crowd like a blanket dropped on a fire. Harold blinked, swallowed. His hand tightened on Elsbeth's shoulder. "Of course she is willing. Tell him, Elsbeth. Tell Mr. Kincaid you are willing." Elsbeth did not speak. Her eyes, cornflower blue, large and expressive, and incapable of hiding anything, said everything her mouth did not. Fear, fury, helplessness. 3 emotions layered on top of each other like 3 coats of paint on an old wall. Each one real, each one visible if you looked. Caleb looked. He saw all 3. Then he looked at Harold, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We have paid in full," Caleb said. His voice was low and level, each word placed with the precision of a man setting stones into a wall. "Winchester rifle, $30 in goods, winter supplies, is agreed." "Exactly." Harold stuck out his hand. "Deal is done." Caleb looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment. Then he shook it. Quick. Final. The kind of handshake that closes a coffin lid. Elsbeth felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The sun was too bright. The crowd's murmuring too loud. She had been sold. Traded like a horse or a plow, her worth measured in flour and tobacco and a repeating rifle. Caleb turned to her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar above his left eyebrow, the careful distance he maintained between his body and hers. Not threatening, just deliberate, just aware. "Your things, I do not." Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by 3 days of dust and silence. She swallowed and tried again. "I do not have things." Something flickered across his expression. Too quick to name. Pain, perhaps, or anger, not directed at her, but at the world that had delivered her here with nothing. He nodded toward a wagon hitched at the end of the street. "Then come on." She looked at her father one last time. Harold had already turned away. He was examining the Winchester, working the lever, action, holding it up to the light to check the bore. His eyes had gone greedy. He did not look back at his daughter, did not say goodbye, did not offer a single word of farewell. She was a transaction completed, a debt settled. The crowd watched in silence as Elsbeth climbed down from the loading platform and followed 3 men she had never met toward a wagon that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. It was a sturdy rig, plain but well constructed, pulled by 2 dappled horses who shifted and stamped as she approached. The woodwork was tight, the iron fittings clean, the bed swept. A wagon built by men who understood that the quality of your tools determined whether you lived or died. Everett opened the back and gestured for her to climb in. She hesitated. This was the moment where everything the town had whispered might come true. 3 mountain men, 1 girl. No one would ever know what happened up there. She could run, scream, fight, but where would she go? Back to the father who had just sold her for a rifle, into the care of the townsfolk who had stood and watched it happen without lifting a single finger. Elsbeth climbed into the wagon. Everett handed her a folded blanket and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Bread and cheese," he said. His voice was gentler than his brother's, calibrated the way you speak to a horse that might spook. "Water skins tied to the side rail if you need them." He climbed into the back of the wagon and sat across from her, but pressed himself against the opposite side, giving her the full width of the wagon bed. All the space that was his to give. Caleb climbed onto the driver's seat. Wyatt appeared beside him, silent as a shadow, and settled with a rifle laid across his thighs, the muzzle pointed away from Elsbeth, deliberately, visibly away, as though he wanted her to see that the weapon was not aimed at her. Caleb released the brake, clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward and Ridgewater began to fall away behind them. Elsbeth sat with her back against the wagon side, the blanket in her lap, the bundle of food in her hands. She did not unwrap it, could not eat. The town disappeared into dust and distance, and with it went everything she had ever known. The general store where she had once bought penny candy with coins her mother slipped her on Saturday mornings. The church steps where she had sat during Sunday socials, invisible and alone, while other girls whispered and laughed. The schoolhouse where Eleanor Whitmore had taught her to write her name before the school marm moved on and no replacement ever came. None of it had been kind, but all of it had been familiar. And there is a particular cruelty in losing even the things that hurt you, because at least you knew their shape. The road climbed steadily upward, leaving the valley behind. Cottonwood trees along the creek banks gave way to ponderosa pine, tall and straight and ancient, their bark a deep reddish orange that broke into puzzle piece patterns in the afternoon light. The air changed, cooled, thinned. The sweet vanilla scent of sun-warmed pine bark drifted through the air, mixing with the sharp, clean smell of creek water running over stones somewhere nearby. The sounds changed too. The clatter of Ridgewater fell away and was replaced by wind in the pines, a deep, continuous murmur, like distant water. The harsh call of a Clark's nutcracker from a high branch. And far off, rising and falling through the mountain valleys, the high, wild bugle of a bull elk calling for a mate. Everett sat across from her in the wagon bed and did not try to make conversation. But he did not ignore her either. Each time the wagon hit a rut and a supply crate shifted, he reached out and steadied it before it could slide toward her. Each time he glanced at her, quick checking, then looked away. After an hour, Caleb glanced back over his shoulder. "You can sit up front if you want. Easier on the spine." Elsbeth did not move. Caleb did not press. Another hour passed. The sun shifted toward late afternoon. Elsbeth's body ached from the hard wagon bed, but she stayed where she was, the blanket clutched in her hands like armor. Finally, Caleb spoke again. His voice was low, barely audible over the creak of the wagon. "I am not going to hurt you." Elsbeth stared at the back of his head. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they settled in her chest like stones dropped into deep water. Men said things like that. Men made promises. And then they did whatever they wanted, because who would stop them? She said nothing. Caleb's shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. "You do not have to believe me yet. That is all right." Everett from the back of the wagon added quietly, "We know you are scared. That makes sense. We will prove it with actions, not words." Wyatt said nothing, but Elsbeth noticed he shifted the rifle again, moving it further to the far side. Away from her, completely visibly away. 3 men who had bought her, and every one of them was trying in his own way to make himself less frightening. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the tops of the western peaks, spilling gold and copper light across a small clearing ringed by towering pines. It was larger than Elsbeth had expected, built from massive ponderosa logs, hand-hewn, with a broad axe fitted together with Scandinavian saddle-notch joinery, the kind that only a skilled builder could execute. The chinking between the logs was clay mixed with dried grass. The roof was hand-split cedar shakes, thousands of them, each one separated from a cedar bolt with a froe and mallet. A fieldstone chimney rose from one end, built from smooth river rocks laid in clay mortar. A covered porch stretched across the front, and beneath its overhang firewood was stacked in neat rows, split and seasoned. A shed stood to the left. Beyond that, a small barn with 2 stalls, a tack room, and a hayloft. And a chicken coop well constructed tight against predators. A creek ran somewhere close. She could hear the water moving over stones. This was not a shack. This was a homestead, built with care, maintained with discipline. The work of men who understood that survival on a Montana mountaintop was about precision and planning and doing every single thing right because the mountain would kill you for every shortcut. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop. All 3 brothers climbed down. Caleb moved to the back and extended his hand to help Elsbeth down. She looked at it, large, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, steady as stone. She ignored it and climbed down on her own. If Caleb was offended, he showed nothing. He simply turned and began unhitching the horses. Wyatt had already vanished toward the barn without a sound. Everett began unloading supply crates. Elsbeth stood in the clearing and tried to understand where she was. The silence was enormous. Not empty, full. Full of wind and water and the settling sounds of evening. No voices, no wagon wheels, no church bells, no drunken shouting. Caleb spoke without looking at her. "Cabin is open. There is a room in the back for you. Oh, we sleep in the loft upstairs." He paused, turned, looked at her directly, his gray eyes grave and steady. "The door to your room does not lock from the outside, only from the inside. There is an iron bar on brackets. You slide it into place whenever you want." Elsbeth blinked. "What? Your room, private. You lock it from your side, if it makes you feel safer." She stared at him. 3 men had bought her, and the first thing the eldest one told her was that her bedroom door locked from the inside. That she controlled the lock. That she decided when it was open and when it was closed. Men did not do this, unless this was a trap, a performance designed to lower her guard. Caleb turned back to the horses, not hovering, not commanding, not even watching. He knew that every glance from a strange man could feel like a threat, and he was removing himself from the equation. She walked slowly to the cabin and pushed open the door. Inside was simple and clean. A large table with 4 chairs, not 3, for one of them, newer than the others, the wood lighter, the joints tighter. Someone had built a 4th chair before she arrived, had planned for her presence, had made her a seat at the table. A stone hearth with a cast-iron cook stove beside it. Shelves lined one wall stocked with glass jars of preserved food, each labeled in neat handwriting. Pickled cucumbers, stewed tomatoes, canned peaches, dried beans, coffee, sugar, salt. 3 bunk beds occupied the far corner. The lower bunk wide and neat with military precision. Caleb's. The middle bunk functional, a folded hide blanket, a hunting knife on a peg. Wyatt's, the top bunk slightly cluttered books wedged against the wall, a pen and inkwell on a small shelf. Everett's. And in the back of the cabin, a solid wooden door. Elsbeth opened it. The room was small but self-contained. A mattress on a low frame. A trunk at the foot of the bed, empty, waiting. A window that looked out over the pine forest. The glass, real not oiled hide. Actual glass that must have been transported at great expense. A patchwork quilt folded at the end of the bed. A hook on the wall for clothes, though she had none to hang. And on the inside of the door, exactly as Caleb had said, a simple iron bar resting in 2 forged brackets. A lock. Her lock. Elsbeth sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at that iron bar for a long time. Outside her door, she heard the brothers return. Caleb's footsteps were the heaviest, steady, and even. Wyatt was nearly silent. Everett was the busiest, pots and pans, the clang of the stove door, the scrape of a match, the crackle of kindling. Nobody called for her. Nobody knocked. Nobody demanded she come down and start earning her keep. The smell of cooking beans and salt pork and cornbread began to fill the cabin. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, but she stayed where she was, mind spinning through every terrible possibility. This was a trap. It had to be. But the evening deepened, the cabin filled with warmth and the scent of simple food. And still nobody called for her. Nobody came to the door. Nobody did anything except cook and eat and speak to each other in low voices. Finally, hunger won. Elsbeth opened the door. 3 men sat around the table. When she appeared in the doorway, Caleb glanced up. Then he gestured to the 4th chair and the plate already prepared and waiting. "Beans and salt pork. Cornbread in the pan if you want it. Coffee is hot." She approached the table the way you approach a wild animal whose intentions you cannot read. Sat down carefully, picked up the spoon. The food was plain but well-seasoned salt and sage cooked with competence. She took 3 bites, then 4, then 5, waiting with each one for the condition, the demand, the moment when kindness curdled into expectation. Caleb finished his meal, stood, carried his plate to a wash basin, scrubbed it clean, and set it on a drying rack. Wyatt did the same wordlessly. Everett cleared the table and stacked the leftover cornbread on a covered plate. Then Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the firelight. "There are rules if you are staying here." Elsbeth's hand froze with the spoon halfway to her mouth. "You do your share of the work. Garden, animals, firewood, cleaning. We will teach you what you do not know. You keep your space. We keep ours. Your room is yours. Nobody goes in unless you invite them. We eat together, we work together, but privacy is sacred. Wyatt spoke. His voice was deeper than Caleb's slower like creek stones rolling along a stream bed. You do not owe us anything beyond fair work. No debts, no obligations past that. Everett added, if you want to leave, you tell us, and we will take you wherever you want to go. No questions asked. But while you are here, you pull your weight and you respect the rules. Clear, Caleb asked. Clear. The word came out barely a whisper. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Good. Finish eating. Morning comes early. The three brothers moved to their bunks. Within minutes, the cabin had settled into the deep, even breathing of sleep. 3 rhythms. The heaviest was Caleb's, but restless a man who slept light and turned at every shift in the wind. The steadiest was Wyatt's, so quiet it was almost absent. The gentlest was Everett's. Elsbeth sat at the table, her plate half finished, her mind reeling. She had been bought, traded, taken from everything she knew, and the 3 men who had done it had given her a room with a lock, a plate of food, a set of rules that included the word privacy, and a chair, a 4th chair that someone had built before she arrived. She did not believe it, could not afford to believe it. But as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of mountain night wind in the pines, the creak of settling logs and 3 steady rhythms of breathing, Elsbeth felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Space to breathe. She finished her meal in silence, washed her plate the way they had done, set it on the drying rack beside theirs. Then she walked back to her room and closed the door. She lay down on the mattress, pulled the patchwork quilt up to her shoulders, stared at the ceiling beams. After a long time, she reached out and slid the iron bar into place. The lock clicked home with a small, final sound. For the first time in 21 years, Elsbeth Whitmore fell asleep behind a door that only she could open. She had until morning to decide, ride back to a life with nothing, or stay on this mountain with 3 men she did not know, and a promise she was not sure they could keep. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines. The creek murmured over stones. Somewhere into the dark timber, an owl called, and after a long silence, another answered. Morning arrived cold and blue. The sky stretched thin and pale above the clearing, laced with high clouds that promised weather. Elsbeth woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for one disoriented moment, she thought she was back in Missouri, back in the farmhouse kitchen, where Eleanor Whitmore had stood at the stove every morning before the sickness took her. Then the moment passed. The ceiling was wrong, the light was wrong. The air was thinner and colder, and smelled of pine instead of river mud. She lay still for a full minute, listening to the sounds outside her door. Caleb's footsteps were steady and even. Wyatt was nearly silent, his presence marked only by the occasional creak of floorboards. Everett was the loudest, pans clanking the stove, door banging, and underneath it all, the ghost of a whistle. In her father's house, the sounds of morning had been warnings. A cabinet slammed too hard meant Harold was already drinking. Silence meant he was brooding, which was worse. Here the sounds meant nothing except that 3 men were making breakfast. And that realization settled over her like a hand placed gently on a wound. She slid the iron bar out of its brackets, opened the door. 3 pairs of eyes glanced up, then glanced away. No lingering, no assessment, just acknowledgement. Caleb stood at the stove. Morning, oatmeal and bacon. Help yourself. She served herself a small portion and sat in the 4th chair. They ate without speaking. It was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. In Harold's house, meals had been minefields. Every silence was a fuse. Here, silence was just silence. And the oatmeal was thick with wild honey. And the bacon was cut in slabs smoked with hickory, and it tasted like nothing she had ever eaten in Missouri. After breakfast, Caleb delivered his assignments the way a field officer delivers orders. Short sentences, clear nouns, no discussion. I am checking the trap line on the North Ridge. Wyatt run the perimeter to the West Creek. There is wolf sign from 2 nights ago. Everett ledger work and fix the harness strap. He looked at Elsbeth. You stay here. Learn the place. Chickens need feeding grain is in the barrel by the coop. Gather eggs if they have laid. Creek is down the path behind the cabin if you need water. Do not wander past the clearing. He pulled on a waxed canvas coat. settled a wide-brimmed felt hat on his head, the low-crowned, practical hat of a man who spent his days in timber. He picked up the Winchester from its place beside the door. He paused, looked back at her. "You will be all right," she nodded. He studied her for one breath longer. Then he stepped outside and was gone. Wyatt was already gone. She had not heard him leave. Everett sat at the table with a leather-bound ledger, a pen, and an ink bottle. He looked up when he felt her watching. "Ranch books," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost warm. "Everybody thinks ranching is chopping wood and shooting game. Truth is, most of it is arithmetic." He gestured at the columns with his pen, not explaining down to her, just talking, the way one person talks to another person they expect to understand. Elsbeth found herself leaning forward to look at the numbers. "You can look," Everett said. "Your mother taught you figures, right? The letters my father wrote, not me." Everett's pen paused. "I know." A silence, then quieter. "That is part of why we are going to do this differently than those letters promised." He went back to his numbers, and Elsbeth went outside to feed the chickens. The days that followed fell into rhythm, the way water finds its course through stone. Slowly at first, testing every crack and crevice, then with surprising ease. Each brother taught her different things, and through those lessons, each brother revealed himself. Caleb taught labor. On the third morning, he led her to the garden plot behind the cabin and handed her a spading fork. "We turn this before winter. Ground needs to rest through the cold months, but it rests better if you work the old roots out first." The work was hard. Within an hour, her shoulders burned and her palms had raised fresh blisters. But Caleb worked beside her without comment, matching her pace, never pulling ahead to make her feel slow, never slowing down to make her feel coddled. At midday, Caleb noticed her hands. He walked to the cabin and returned with a small tin. "Give me your hands." She hesitated. "Salve, calendula and beeswax. Keeps blisters from going bad." Slowly, Elsbeth extended her hands. Caleb applied the ointment with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers careful around the raw skin, touching only where the salve needed to go and nowhere else. "You will build calluses," he said, not looking at her face. "Takes a few weeks, then the work feels easier." "Does it really get easier?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but the place where a smile had once lived and might visit again someday. "The work stays the same. You get stronger. Feels like easier." Wyatt taught the forest. He appeared beside her one afternoon and led her along a game trail into the timber, without a word of explanation. For 20 minutes they walked in silence. Every twig she stepped on cracked like a gunshot. Wyatt did not comment. He simply kept walking, pausing to crouch and point at things on the ground. A hoof print in soft earth, narrow and delicate, the track of a white-tailed doe. Scattered feathers near a fallen log where a hawk had taken a rabbit. Claw marks on the bark of a ponderosa, 4 deep grooves, the territorial marking of a black bear. Another day, following a deer track through fresh snow, he stopped suddenly and pointed not at the ground, but at a branch that had snapped at a particular angle. "Hunter," he said. "Wolf, passed an hour ago." Elsbeth looked at the broken branch. She would never have noticed it. "How do you know it was a wolf and not wind?" And Wyatt's mouth opened just barely. "Wind does not have claws." Then he pointed at the snow below the branch where she could see the faint impression of a paw print her untrained eyes had dismissed as shadow. One morning during her second week, Wyatt was teaching her to ride. Ash, the dapple-gray mare, was walking a steady circle around the clearing. Then, without warning, the mare stopped. Dead still. Refused to move. Elsbeth squeezed her heels, clucked her tongue. Nothing. She looked at Wyatt, who stood a few paces away with his arms crossed and his face completely blank. "You are sitting on the Brussels sprouts she likes," he said. Elsbeth looked down. Ash had stopped directly on top of the small row of Brussels sprouts that Caleb had planted along the garden border. The mare was eating them with obvious pleasure. Elsbeth laughed. The sound surprised her so much she almost choked on it. It came out rough and strange, rusty from disuse. But it was a laugh, the first one since Missouri, maybe the first one in much longer than that. From the porch, Everett called out, "Ash hates Brussels sprouts less than Caleb does." That is saying something. Wyatt's face remained flat, but his amber eyes brightened just slightly, almost a smile. Everett taught knowledge. In the evenings after supper, he spread his books on the table and pushed Elsbeth through texts more complex than anything Eleanor Whitmore had taught. Legal contracts, land deeds, bills of sale. "Why do I need to learn this?" she asked one night, looking up from a particularly impenetrable paragraph about water rights. "Because ignorance makes you vulnerable," Everett said. "Men take advantage of people who cannot read the fine print, who do not understand numbers, who cannot calculate their own worth." He tapped the contract. "You are never going to be that person." He taught her chess on a board of walnut. The pieces were hand-carved by Caleb from white oak and black cherry. Each piece had character. "Caleb carved these our first winter up here," Everett explained. "Nothing to do at night but stare at the fire." He started carving and did not stop until they were finished. He picked up a knight. "This is the piece Wyatt likes best. The knight moves in a path no other piece can follow." She lost the first 3 games quickly, but by the fourth she had begun to see patterns. When they finished that evening, Wyatt, who had been silently carving something small with his knife, reached across the table and set a tiny wooden figure beside Elspeth's king. It was a bird, small, delicate wings half spread. "New piece," Wyatt said, 2 words. And that was the first time he gave Elspeth anything he had made with his own hands. One night during the second week, Elsbeth woke to a sound from outside her room, a low moan muffled. Then a name whispered with the raw, broken edge of a man caught in a nightmare. "Sarah," and then softer, "Emma." Caleb was dreaming. She pressed her ear to the door and listened to the nightmare run its course. The restless turning, the sharp intake of breath when he woke, the heavy silence that followed. Water being poured, a cup set down, nothing else. In the morning she said nothing. But when she came out and found Caleb at the table with his coffee, his face drawn and his eyes carrying the weight of wherever he had been in the night, she poured him a second cup without being asked. The first voluntary act of care she had offered since arriving. Caleb looked at the cup, looked at her, and nodded. Small, almost invisible. 2 days later, on a cold evening when the first real snow had begun to fall, Elsbeth asked the question that had been building inside her for 14 days. "Why do you live up here alone?" The cabin went still. "Tried living down in the world," Caleb said, and his voice went flat and distant. "After the war, after I lost my family. But everywhere I went, I kept seeing them. My wife, my daughter, in doorways, in windows, in the way light touched a woman's hair, or a child laughed somewhere out of sight. Ghosts everywhere. Doesn't it get lonely?" Lonely is different from alone. Alone is peaceful. Lonely is when you are surrounded by people and still feel like you are the only one in the room. He glanced at her. "You know what I mean." She did. "How did they die?" Caleb set down his fork. "Fire. During the war. Irregulars came through burning homes of Union sympathizers. I was away scouting. Came back to ashes." He stared at his plate. "Found them in what used to be the bedroom. Sarah had tried to get Emma out. Almost made it to the window." Everett spoke, his voice rough. "Emma was 7. She used to name the chickens. That is why I cannot stomach men who trade their children like livestock." Caleb said, his gray eyes finding Elspeth's and holding them. "That is why I could not stand there and watch your father do what he did. Some things you cannot let pass. It became your business when you bought me. No, it became my business when I saw a gay girl being sold and remembered what it feels like to lose one. The buying was just the means." Something cracked open in Elsbeth's cras, a small, guarded place that had been locked tight since Eleanor died. "Thank you," she managed. 3 nods, not coordinated, 3 separate versions of the same acknowledgement. Caleb's was short and final, Wyatt's was slow and heavy, Everett's was gentle, accompanied by a sad half-smile. That night, something happened that changed the texture of the air inside the cabin. The chickens erupted into sudden, panicked squawking. Elsbeth sat up in bed, heart hammering. She heard Caleb's boots hit the floor, the metallic sound of the Winchester's lever. The cabin door opened, letting in cold air and the screaming of terrified hens. Then Wyatt was gone, dissolved into the darkness through some exit she did not know about. Everett stood near the front window, a hunting knife in his hand, all warmth absent from his face. 10 minutes of silence. Then Wyatt was back. He materialized in the doorway as though assembled from cold air and purpose. "Wolf," he said. "One gone." 3 words. Sufficient. Caleb set the Winchester down. "It is all right," he called toward Elsbeth's door. "Go back to sleep." She returned to bed, but through her window she could see the outline of Caleb on the porch. Rifle across his knees, hat pulled low, shoulders dusted with frost, watching the tree line, guarding the clearing, for the rest of the night. In the morning she brought him coffee on the porch. He had been sitting there for hours. When she extended the cup, their fingers touched, just for a moment, less than a heartbeat, the warmth of her hand against the cold of his. Then both of them pulled back. Neither spoke. But the warmth of that accidental contact lingered longer than the coffee. That night, Elsbeth went to her room, closed the door, stood in the dark with her hand on the iron bar. She thought about the wolf, about Caleb sitting on the porch all night, about Wyatt emerging from darkness with 3 words and certainty, about Everett standing at the window with a knife, the gentlest brother transformed into something sharp and ready. She thought about the 4th chair, and for the first time since arriving, Elsbeth Whitmore did not slide the iron bar into place. She left the door unlatched. Not open, just unlocked. A gesture so small that no one watching would have noticed. But she knew, and she suspected that Caleb would know too. 3 weeks into her time at the cabin, the visitor arrived. Elsbeth was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the jingle of harness bells and the steady clop of hooves. She froze. Then she saw Caleb emerge from the barn with his Winchester cradled casually in one arm. Ready, but not raised. Wyatt appeared from the eastern tree line. She never knew where Wyatt was until he decided to be seen. The rider was a woman, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, sitting astride a sturdy paint horse with the easy confidence of someone born in a saddle. She wore men's trousers, a canvas coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded a face mapped with years and weather. "Caleb Kincaid," she called. "I heard you went and did something foolish." Ruth Caldwell, the faintest trace of warmth in Caleb's voice, did not know minding my own business counted as foolish. Depends on whose business you are minding. Ruth swung down from her horse and turned to look directly at Elsbeth. Her gaze was thorough, clinical, the gaze of a woman who had delivered babies and set bones and dug bullets out of men's shoulders by lamplight. "You must be the girl from Missouri. Elsbeth, is it?" Elsbeth nodded. Ruth crossed the clearing. "I am Ruth Caldwell, live about 10 miles south. I help folks with birthing and healing when they need it. Heard the Kincaid brothers had brought someone up from town. Thought I would ride by and see for myself." "Everything is fine," Elsbeth said. Ruth's eyes sharpened. "That's so. Mind if I see your hands?" Elsbeth extended her hands, palms up. Ruth took them, studying the calluses, the fading blisters, the rough but healing skin. "Working hard. Eating regular." "Yes, ma'am." "Sleeping all right, nobody bothering you at night?" "I sleep in my own room. It has a lock." Elsbeth paused. "I locked it every night at first. Recently, I stopped." Ruth released her hands and looked at Caleb. Something passed between them that did not require words. "All right, then." Ruth reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Needle and thread, spare fabric, buttons. She pressed the bundle into Elsbeth's hands and lowered her voice. "You ever need help for any reason, you walk south following the creek. About 2 hours on Foot Meadow with 3 white birch trees. My cabin is just beyond. Day or night. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Ruth squeezed her shoulder, then turned to Caleb. "Walk with me a minute." They moved toward the barn, speaking in tones too low for Elsbeth to hear. When they returned, Ruth mounted up. "Keep her safe, Kincaid, or I will come for you with more than words." "I would not expect anything less." Ruth rode away. Inside the bundle, Elsbeth found sewing, supplies, a small jar of honey, a twist of dried herbs, and a folded piece of paper with neat handwriting. "You are not alone." In the first week of December, they went to the valley. Samuel Ironwood's land spread across a wide hollow where 3 creeks converged. The barn was enormous, built from honey-colored logs with a gently curved roof. About 40 people had gathered. Mountain folk, people who measured wealth in seed stores and livestock. Ruth linked her arm through Elsbeth's and steered her into the barn, introducing her to a group of women. Sarah Colton, a sturdy woman with flour on her apron. Mary Dancing Hawk, whose silver-streaked black hair framed eyes that seemed to look through walls. Sarah did not reach for Elsbeth's hands. She did not need to. She looked at the girl's face instead, studied it the way a woman studies weather when her hay is drying in the field. Then she looked at her shoulders, the way they sat square and level instead of hunched, the way her chin stayed up when she answered questions instead of dropping to her chest. "You look me straight in the eye when I ask hard questions," Sarah said. "You stand like someone who has been doing real work and sleeping without fear. That tells me more than your hands ever could." She smiled. "Then welcome. We look after our own out here." Before the gathering ended, Samuel Ironwood sought Elsbeth out directly. White hair deeply lined with the quiet authority of a man who had earned respect by being worthy of it. For so long, it had become as natural as breathing. "My people have some understanding of what it means to be treated as property," he said, "to have your worth measured by what others can take from you. It is a particular kind of violence being sold, but it does not define you. Only you define yourself." 3 days after the gathering, the warning came. Jacob Kimball, Ruth's son, came riding fast up the trail. 3 riders came through this morning asking questions. Your girl's father, a man claiming to be a county sheriff, and a deputy. They have papers to bring her back. Caleb's face went flat and hard. The soldier's face. "We leave tonight," he said. "We go to Samuel Ironwood's place. Safety, numbers, witnesses." They packed in the dark, only essentials. Caleb stood beside the locked trunk, his hand on the dark wood fingers tracing the rusted iron fittings. "Leaving this behind too," he said quietly. "If they burn the cabin out of spite, better it goes than Sarah and Emma travel into danger again." Would they really burn it? "Men like your father do spiteful things when they feel wronged," Wyatt said from the doorway. "And men like that sheriff do whatever they are paid to do." "Wood and nails," Caleb said, "can be rebuilt." He looked at her. "You cannot be replaced." 4 hours through snow and darkness. On the wagon, Elsbeth sat wrapped in blankets. "I am sorry," she said, "for bringing this trouble to you." "Then you would be trapped in Missouri or worse," Caleb said from the driver's seat. "And I would still be in that cabin pretending isolation was the same as peace. Even if they burn your home." Caleb did not answer immediately. The wagon creaked through darkness. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that the words seemed to belong to the night itself. "I have lost a home before. What I could not survive losing twice was the chance to do something when it mattered." They arrived at Samuel Ironwood's homestead well past midnight. Winona Ironwood wrapped Elsbeth in a blanket that smelled of sage and juniper smoke. "You are safe here, child. Whatever comes tomorrow, you are safe." By dawn, 20 families had arrived. Wagons circled the yard like a fortress of witness and will. Ruth Caldwell rode in at first light. Armed men on porches and wagon seats. Women in doorways. A community that had drawn its line. Near mid-morning, 3 riders appeared on the southern trail. Harold Whitmore, a man with a badge, a deputy with a swagger. "We are looking for Harold Whitmore's daughter. We have legal papers authorizing her return." Samuel stepped forward. "I am Samuel Ironwood. This is my land. State your business proper or turn around." Caleb Kincaid, accused of purchasing a minor female for immoral purposes. Caleb descended the porch steps slowly. "I paid the bride price in full, witnessed by half of Ridgewater. Her father sold her on the steps of Brennan's General Store. Any immorality belongs to the man who sold his daughter. She is my daughter, my property. She is 21, and I had every right the moment you put a price on her and accepted payment." Samuel examined the papers with deliberate slowness. "This is not a legal document. The signatures are inconsistent. The seal is irregular. This is a forgery." "That is a lie," Harold snarled. "No." Samuel held up the paper. "This is the lie, and every person here is a witness." The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. Instantly, every armed man in the yard raised his weapon. Not aiming, just ready. And from the timber to the south, a single sharp crack. A branch broken deliberately. Wyatt reminding them there was at least one gun they could not see. "This is not over," the man with the badge said. "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." Harold jerked his horse forward. "She is my daughter." And then Elsbeth stepped out of the house. She walked out of the shadow and into the winter sunlight. She stood where everyone could see her. the calloused hands, the straight back, the clear blue eyes. "You were my father," she said. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Until you sold me. You gave up that right when you traded me for a rifle and $30 in goods. I am not going back with you. Not now, not ever." Harold stared at her. Shock. The shock of a man looking at someone he does not recognize. Because the girl he had sold would not have spoken, would not have stood in front of witnesses and claimed her own freedom. The three men rode away, one by one. The man with the badge first, the deputy second, Harold last. His eyes locked on Elsbeth until the trail swallowed him. The silence that followed was enormous. Then someone laughed, others joined. And the yard filled with the particular joy of ordinary people who had stood together against wrong. Caleb crossed the yard to where Elsbeth stood. "You all right?" "I think so. I just told him no. For the first time in my life." "You were brave." "I was terrified." Brave does not mean not scared. It means scared and doing it anyway. "I am not his anymore. I am mine." "Yes," he said, "you are." Then Wyatt was there, not arriving, not approaching, simply present the way he always was when the important things happened, as though he had been standing in that exact spot all along, and the world had finally caught up to him. His bow hung over one shoulder. Snow dusted his hair. He stopped in front of Elsbeth and did not speak. He simply nodded. One nod. Final. Beyond discussion. Behind them, Everett stood on the porch steps. His eyes were red. He managed a nod and a smile that was more water than light. They returned to the cabin 3 days later. It stood exactly as they had left it. When Caleb offered his hand to help Elsbeth down from the wagon, she took it. For the first time, his grip was steady, warm despite the cold. She held it for one moment longer than necessary before letting go. That evening, Caleb sat her down with cold coffee and serious eyes. "Things are going to be different now. The whole territory knows. We need to formalize this arrangement." Everett nodded. "Employment contract, wages held in trust, clear boundaries. Everything documented." "I want to stay," Elsbeth said, "at least through winter. Maybe spring. I want to keep learning. Then I want to decide what comes next from a position of strength, not desperation." 2 weeks later, Ruth arrived with papers, a formal employment contract specifying duties, establishing wages, defining boundaries. Ruth corrected 2 points of language and witnessed the signing. "This protects all of you," Ruth said. "How are you doing? Really?" "Better than I have ever been. Sometimes I catch myself forgetting to be afraid, and that feels strange." "That is called healing. Takes time to trust it." Winter deepened through December into January. Snow piled against the barn walls. Temperatures dropped to 20 below. The clearing shrank to a narrow corridor. Inside the cabin, life contracted to the warm circle of firelight. Elsbeth grew stronger. The girl who had climbed into the wagon with trembling hands and hunched shoulders had begun to straighten it to fill space without apology. She could split a morning's worth of kindling without stopping hall water that would have defeated her a month ago, and handle the horses with quiet confidence that made even Flint nuzzle her shoulder. One night in February, during a blizzard that kept them all inside for 3 days, Caleb opened the locked trunk. Elsbeth was mending a shirt by the fire when she heard the creak of hinges. She looked up and saw Caleb kneeling beside the trunk. The lid raised, his hands hovering over the contents, as if afraid to touch them. "Thought it was time," he said quietly. "Been carrying this weight for years. Maybe it is time to set some of it down." He lifted out a dress first, pale blue fabric, carefully folded, yellowed slightly with age. Then a smaller dress, child-sized with embroidered flowers along the hem. A bundle of letters tied with ribbon. A daguerreotype in a tarnished frame showing a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression holding a small girl on her lap. "That is Sarah," Caleb said, "and Emma. She was 4 when this was made, died when she was 7. Elsbeth set down her mending and moved to sit beside him. "They were beautiful. They were everything." His voice was rough with old grief. "Sarah was a teacher before we married. Smart, determined, stubborn when she believed in something. Emma had her mother's eyes and her father's terrible sense of humor. She used to make up songs about the chickens." Everett spoke from his bunk, his voice thick. "I carved that wooden horse for her 3rd birthday. She carried it everywhere, talked to it like it was real. He paused. Found it in the ashes after the fire. About all that survived intact. Caleb held the wooden horse. Small, delicate, carved with loving detail. For a long time I thought opening this trunk would destroy me. That seeing these things would bring it all back and I would drown in it. He paused, searching for words. But sitting here now looking at Sarah's dress and Emma's toy, I just feel sad. Not destroyed, just sad that they are gone, and grateful I had them at all. That sounds like healing too, Elspeth said. Maybe. He carefully replaced the items, but he did not close the lid this time. Left it open, the contents visible, no longer locked away. I think Emma would have liked you, he said. You have got her stubbornness. March arrived with hints of thaw, dripping icicles, patches of bare ground in the clearing, the first crocuses pushing through snow. One afternoon, checking the chickens, Elsbeth found something that made her call for Caleb with urgency. He came running, rifle in hand, then stopped. She was holding a hawk, young, maybe a year old, with a broken wing and blood matting its feathers. It had crashed into the chicken wire and could not fly, could only drag itself in circles, eyes wild with pain. Wing is broken, Caleb said, kneeling beside the bird. Kindest thing would be to put it down quick. Can we not try to help it? Please. Caleb looked at her, then at the hawk. Then he sighed. All right, but you are doing the work. I will show you how, but you have to commit to it. Feeding, cleaning, keeping it calm while it heals. All on you. I can do it. They built a small enclosure in the barn. Caleb showed her how to immobilize the wing with splints, how to handle the bird without getting slashed by talons, how to feed it strips of raw meat on a stick. The hawk screamed and struggled, refused food for 2 days, attacked anything that came near. But slowly, day by day, it began to tolerate Elsbeth's bulbous presence. She called it grace. Why grace? Everett asked one evening. Because grace is what you give when something is broken. You gave it to me. I'm giving it to her. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. That is a good reason. Through late March and into April, Elsbeth tended Grace while helping prepare for planting season. The hawk grew stronger daily. The wing healed remarkably well. Grace could hop from perch to perch, spread her wings without pain, grip Elsbeth's leather-wrapped arm with talons that had regained their crushing strength. Spring arrived fully. The snow retreated. Wildflowers pushed through bare ground. And at a large gathering at Ironwood's ranch, larger than the winter one, with people from Ridgewater coming out to hear the truth. Elsbeth stood on Samuel's porch before 60 people and told her story. From the loading platform to the cabin, from the locked door to the open one, from the girl who could not speak to the woman who chose her own freedom. When she finished, a woman she did not recognize stepped forward. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being heard. I am Catherine Harwell. I run a school for girls in Denver. I came here because I heard about this situation and wanted to assess it for myself. She looked directly at Elsbeth. In my professional opinion, she has been rescued, not exploited. And furthermore, she is exactly the kind of girl my school exists to serve. I would like to offer Miss Whitmore a place at my school. Full scholarship, room and board included, education in literature, mathematics, sciences, and practical arts. Upon graduation, she would be qualified to teach, manage a business, or pursue any number of professions. The offer hung in the air like a gift and a test. That night, back at the cabin, Elsbeth could not sleep. She climbed out of her room and found Caleb at the table writing by lamplight. Letter to Catherine Harwell, he said, telling her to watch out for you and to push you hard. You think I should go? I think you should consider it seriously. It is exactly what I meant when I said you needed options. I do not want to leave. I know, but sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. His voice was gentle. The cabin will always be here, Elsbeth. I will always be here, but opportunities like this do not come often. The next evening she heard something she was not meant to hear. Caleb's voice, low and rough, speaking to Wyatt and Everett while she was supposed to be in the barn tending Grace. She should go. That is the right thing. We did not buy her to keep her. We bought her to give her freedom. And freedom means she has to have the right to choose to leave. Everett's voice strained. You sure she is just starting to belong here? Caleb, rougher now. Her potential is bigger than this cabin, and I will not be the one who cages her again, even if this cage is more comfortable. Elsbeth stood behind the door listening, and the tears came silently. Not because they were sending her away, but because Caleb was right, and because she understood what it cost him to say it. He was choosing to let go, not because he wanted to, but because it was the best thing for her. The way you release a healed bird, even though the barn feels emptier without it. 2 days before she was scheduled to leave, they took Grace to the high meadow above the cabin. A clear morning sky, endless blue air, sharp with pine and new grass. Elsbeth wore her heavy leather glove. Grace perched on her arm, head swiveling, eyes bright. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked. "No, but it is right." She removed the tether with shaking hands. Grace shifted, testing her freedom wings, half spreading. For a long moment, the hawk simply sat, as if uncertain what to do without the familiar weight of restraint. Then she launched. The takeoff was powerful, clean, perfect. Grace's wings caught air and pulled her upward in strong, steady beats. She circled the meadow once, twice, gaining altitude. On the third circle, she broke away and flew north toward the deeper mountains, toward freedom and wild sky. Elsbeth stood with her arms still extended, the empty glove, suddenly heavy tears streaming down her face. Caleb's hand found her shoulder. "You gave her a second chance. That is everything. I am going to miss her." "Of course you are. But she is where she belongs now, just like you will be where you belong soon." The night before she left, Caleb went to the open trunk and lifted out a folded quilt. Patchwork squares in blues and greens stitched with careful love. The quilt Sarah had been making when she died. "I want you to have this." Elsbeth's throat closed. "I cannot take that. It is Sarah's. Sarah would want it used, not stored away. And you need something from home to take with you. Something that reminds you where you came from and where you can always return." He pressed the quilt into her hands. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Along one edge, she found stitching initials and a date. S.K. 1862. Sarah Kincaid. Making something beautiful in the middle of war and uncertainty. Everett placed a leather-bound journal in her hands. From Wyatt, "He is not good at saying goodbye." Wyatt stood by the window. He did not speak. He simply nodded. "Thank you," Elsbeth whispered. "I will take care of it." "I know you will." Morning came too quickly. Caleb loaded her trunk into the wagon. All her belongings fit in one small chest. The clothes Sarah Colton and Ruth had helped make. The books Everett had given her. The journal from Wyatt. Sarah's quilt folded carefully on top. The ride to the stage stop took most of the morning. 4 people. Elsbeth between Caleb and Everett on the driver's seat, Wyatt riding alongside on Flint. The small way station appeared a rough building where the stage made weekly stops. Caleb helped her down and carried her trunk to the loading area. They stood in the dusty yard. "I do not know if I can do this," she said suddenly. Caleb took her shoulders gently, making her look at him. "Listen to me. You stood on a loading platform and survived being sold. You climbed into a stranger's wagon, not knowing if you would live through the night. You split wood in snowstorms, faced down your father with armed men at his back, nursed a wild hawk back to flight. You can absolutely handle a school full of girls and teachers. What if I forget everything you taught me? You will not. And if you do, you will relearn it. Learning is a skill like any other. Gets easier with practice. What if I am lonely? Then you write. I'm not much for correspondence, but I will answer every letter." Everett added, his eyes wet. "Read everything twice. Trust nothing until you verify it yourself." Wyatt reached into his coat and pressed something into her hand, a small pocket knife with a bone handle. "So you can always cut yourself free." 5 words, the most she had ever heard him say at once. The stagecoach appeared, pulled by 6 horses. The driver called them to a halt. "Passenger for Denver." Elsbeth turned to face the 3 men who had bought her freedom and taught her to be free. Caleb, who kept his promises and expected nothing in return except that she become herself. Wyatt, who taught her to read forests and silence. Everett, who opened the door of knowledge and smiled when she walked through it. "Thank you," she said. Inadequate words for enormous debt. For everything. For saving me, for teaching me, for believing I could be more than what I was. "You saved yourself," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he did not try to hide. "We just provided the space to do it." He paused. "Be brave, Elspeth. Be smart. Be kind. And come home when you need to." She hugged him then, properly. arms tight around his waist, face pressed against his chest, breathing in the familiar smell of pine and leather and wood smoke. He held her carefully, his hand gentle on her back. She hugged Everett, who held her tight and whispered, "Make yourself proud." She hugged Wyatt, the briefest embrace, the strongest grip. And when he let go, she climbed into the stagecoach before she could lose her nerve. Through the window, three men stood in the dust, hats in hand, watching. The driver cracked his whip. The horses lurched forward. The stage rolled away from the way station, away from the mountains, away from the cabin that had been her refuge in her transformation. Elsbeth watched through the window until Caleb became a distant figure, then a speck, then disappeared entirely. She pressed her forehead against the glass and cried quietly, grieving what she was leaving behind, even as she reached toward what lay ahead. Denver, the school, Catherine Harwell waiting at the depot. "Welcome to Denver, Miss Whitmore." A room shared with Nettie Dawson, a girl from a mining family whose father had died in a cave collapse and whose mother had worked herself hollow, trying to support four children. Different details, but the same core of hardship survived and opportunity seized. The first month was exactly as difficult as Catherine had warned. Elsbeth struggled with subjects she had never studied, felt constantly behind in literature and history. But her mathematics skills, honed by Everett's practical teaching, were excellent. Her writing was clear and powerful, and her willingness to work to study late, to push through frustration, earned grudging respect. She wrote to the Kincaid brothers weekly. Caleb's responses were brief but steady, updates about the homestead, news from the mountain families, and always at the end, "The cabin is still here." Everett's letters were longer, community news, humor, questions about her studies, and always read everything twice. Wyatt did not write, but in Everett's letters, occasionally Wyatt sends his regards, meaning he nodded when your name was mentioned. Christmas break, she traveled back to the mountains. The cabin looked exactly as she had left it. Caleb met her at the stage stop. "You have changed," he observed. "Carry yourself different, more confident." "I have learned things about the world, about myself, about how much I did not know." That is the best kind of learning. 2 weeks of familiar rhythms, chess, firelight conversations, the quiet comfort of people who had earned each other's trust through months of shared labor and honest silence. "I am proud of you," Caleb said simply. "You took a chance and made it work. Because you prepared me. Everything you taught me, the resilience, the self-reliance, the refusal to accept other people's definitions. That is what is getting me through." 3 years passed. Elsbeth graduated near the top of her class. Her capstone project, a comprehensive proposal for legal reforms to protect children from exploitation, caught the attention of territorial lawmakers. She was offered a position with a women's advocacy organization in Denver, drafting legislation and providing legal support to women and children in difficult circumstances. She visited the cabin every few months, long weekends with the Kincaid brothers, helping with seasonal work, playing chess, catching up. The mountain community welcomed her back each time as one of their own. The spring that Elsbeth did not leave the cabin again. No one was surprised, not Ruth, who had watched the quiet gravity between Elsbeth and Caleb deepen over years of letters and visits, and the particular kind of patience that only people who have survived loss together can understand. Not Samuel Ironwood, who nodded once when he heard and said only "about time." Not the mountain families who had known before either of them that some distances are measured not in miles but in the time it takes two wounded people to trust each other enough to stop keeping score. The wedding was small, on the cabin porch in autumn, with the aspens turning gold on the mountainside and the first cold wind carrying the smell of snow from the peaks above. Ruth stood as witness. 30 mountain folk attended. Everett read from a book of poetry that had belonged to their mother. Wyatt stood beside Caleb and did not speak, which was his way of saying everything that mattered. Years accumulated the way snow accumulates in the high country, layer upon layer, each one changing the landscape slightly, until one day you look up and realize the world has been remade while you were busy living in it. The cabin expanded. 2 rooms became 4, then 6. The garden tripled in size. Elsbeth opened a small school in Ridgewater, teaching children and grown women to read and write and do arithmetic. The building started as a single room with a wood stove and 12 students. Within 5 years, the community had raised money for a proper brick building with glass windows and 20 desks. Nettie Dawson came to Montana to teach beside her. The two women who had shared a dormitory room in Denver now shared a purpose, ensuring that every girl in the territory had access to the education that had changed their own lives. The legislation Elsbeth had drafted in Denver eventually became law. The Territorial Child Protection Act of 1881, known informally as Elsbeth's Law, prohibited the sale of minors and required verified consent for mail order, bride arrangements involving women under 21. It was not perfect, no law is, but it was a start, and every start is built on the foundation of someone who refused to accept the way things were. Caleb aged the way mountains age, slowly and with dignity. His hair went fully white, his steps grew more deliberate, but he still split wood every morning because, as he told Elsbeth once, "The day I stop splitting wood is the day I stop." His gray eyes never lost their sharpness. His hands never lost their steadiness. And the cabin he had built with those hands, the cabin that had sheltered a grieving soldier and a soul girl, and the slow, careful construction of something neither of them had dared to hope for, that cabin still stood exactly where it had always stood, solid and warm, and full of the particular silence that exists between two people who no longer need words to understand each other. Wyatt remained. He never married, never seemed to want to. The forest was his companion, the mountains his cathedral. He taught tracking to the children of the community, leading them on expeditions through the timber where they learned to read the ground the way their grandparents had read books. He grew quieter with age, which hardly seemed possible, but the silence he carried became less guarded and more peaceful. The silence of a man who had found exactly the right distance between himself and the world and was content to maintain it. Everett married a schoolteacher from Helena who appreciated his books and tolerated his habit of reading at the dinner table. They built a cabin half a mile from Caleb's, close enough for daily visits, far enough for privacy. He continued to keep meticulous ranch books, now filling an entire shelf. He wrote occasional essays for the territorial newspaper on subjects ranging from land rights to the proper care of Dominique chickens, and his prose carried the same gentle precision that had characterized everything he did since boyhood. One summer evening in 1898, 25 years after a girl had been sold on the steps of Brennan's General Store in Ridgewater, Elsbeth sat on the cabin porch with Caleb. She was 46 years old. He was 66. The clearing was peaceful, chickens settling for the night, smoke rising from the chimney, the garden green and full. Caleb had been quiet all evening, quieter than usual, which was saying something. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking about the trunk." The trunk had been empty for years. He had donated Sarah's dresses and Emma's things to Catherine Harwell's school in Denver. The wooden horse Everett had carved sat on a shelf in the school's entrance hall, where every new student was told its story. A story about loss and love, and the difference between owning someone and caring for them. "What about it?" Elsbeth asked. "I do not need it anymore. The trunk, I mean. Used to be I needed it locked because I was afraid opening it would destroy me. Then I opened it and found out it would not. Then I gave away what was inside because keeping it locked up was not honoring them, it was hiding from them." He paused. "Now the trunk is empty, and I think maybe it is time to let it go too. What would you do with it? Give it to the school. Let them fill it with something new. Letters from students, drawings, whatever they want to put in it. Let it hold hope instead of grief." Elsbeth reached across and took his hand, the same hand that had extended to help her down from the wagon on the first day and been refused. The same hand that had applied calendula salve to her blisters with such unexpected gentleness. The same hand that had held a rifle through a frozen night to keep her safe. "Sarah would have liked that," she said. "I think so too." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear, the familiar constellations in their appointed places. Somewhere in the forest an owl called, and after a pause, another answered. The creek murmured its endless song. "Do you ever regret it?" Elsbeth asked. "Buying me that day, taking on all the complications." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "I regret that you had to be sold in the first place. Regret that the world is built in ways that let that happen." He shook his head. "But regret bringing you here, teaching you, watching you grow into who you are now. No, that has been the best thing I have done in years, maybe ever. I used to think you saved me, Elsbeth said softly, but I understand now that is not quite right. You gave me the space to save myself. There is a difference. There is, and you used that space well. She pulled Sarah's quilt tighter around her shoulders. The quilt was worn, now mended many times with her own hands, the original blues and greens faded but still visible beneath patches of newer fabric. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke in the particular warmth of a life lived fully. You know what I remember most about that first day, she said. The loading platform. No, the fourth chair. Caleb looked at her. Someone had built a fourth chair before I arrived, before you even knew who I was or whether I would stay. Someone had already made me a place at the table. She paused. That was when I started to think maybe the letter had not lied about everything. Maybe it had just told the wrong truth. The wrong truth. The letter promised a home, and it lied because what I found was not a home. It was 3 men and a locked door and a tin of calendula salve in a mountain that did not care whether I lived or died. She looked out over the clearing, the garden, the barn, the pines standing dark against the evening sky. But it turned out that was exactly what home was. I just did not know it yet. Caleb was quiet for a long time. The firelight from inside the cabin cast long shadows across the porch. The wind moved through the high pines with the sound that had become over 25 years as familiar to Elsbeth as her own breathing. You know, he said the day I wrote that advertisement, I was not looking for a wife. Everett wrote the words, but I told him what to say. And what I said was, we need help, that is all. We need someone. I did not know what kind of someone. Did not know I was writing a letter that would bring you here. He paused. But I think maybe the mountain knew. This mountain has a way of giving you what you need instead of what you ask for. Elsbeth leaned against his shoulder, solid, warm, steady as the stone chimney he had built with his own hands 30 years ago, and that had not shifted a single inch since. The letter promised a home, she said again, and it lied. She looked out at the world they had built, the world she had earned with calloused hands and a straight back, and the refusal to let anyone at all tell her what she was worth. But I am grateful it lied, because if it had told the truth, if it had said one husband and one house and one ordinary life, I would never have found this. I would never have found any of it. Caleb's arms settled around her shoulders, not pulling, not possessing, just present, the way he had always been present. From the first day to this one, somewhere in the forest, the owl called again. And again, after a long, patient silence, the answer came. The creek murmured over stones. The wind breathed through the pines. The stars turned overhead with the slow, certain patience of things that have been here longer than any human grief or joy, and will remain long after both have passed into the quiet company of memory. And Elsbeth Whitmore, the girl who had been sold for a rifle and $30 on the steps of a general store in a town that barely deserved the name, sat on the porch of the home she had built, with the man who had taught her that freedom was not something given, but something grown and understood at last what she had been sold to find. Not servitude, not diminishment, not the small, caged life her father had imagined for her, but herself, whole, free, and finally completely her own. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week. And leave a comment telling me, do you think Elsbeth should have stayed at the cabin, or was she right to go to Denver first? I want to hear what you think. Next week, a new story from the mountains. Until then, stay warm, stay strong, and remember what Caleb Kincaid said. The work stays the same. You get stronger. Feels like easier.